Hi, seeing some faces. Turn up my volume so you all can hear me okay. I'm not sure if I don't see Rebecca anymore on the screen, so I didn't know if I am just going to jump into my presentation. But I recognize that we have just an hour with each other. So because I don't see her anywhere, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and get started. And if she needs to or does jump back in or jump on and give an intro, then I'll pause for her to do that. But I just want to stay cognizant of time this afternoon and be respectful of you all's time and schedule. So um, I'm Carrie McLean. I serve as the Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer here at the Tulsa City County Library. There she is. Hi,
Hey,
Becca.
so this only happens when I'm moderating. I never like my whole computer just decided to like shut down completely. So hi everyone, welcome. Hi Carrie. So
Hello.
sorry for the you know
I was attempting
stop.
to fill in the gap. I thought maybe something happened because you disappeared. It's like, oh no, we'll
I
roll with
have no doubt you filled the gap beautifully. So we'll go ahead and get started and welcome to all of you. If you would please, if the name on your Zoom account does not match the name you registered under, if you would change that or just drop your name in the chat, I'll be taking attendance and sending that on to our CE so that you can get some credit for attending today, but very excited that you all can be here. And really happy to have Carrie McLean with us today. I am fortunate enough to be able to get to work with Carrie at Tulsa City County Library. That is where she serves as the Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer. And in this role, she leads the library's ED&I strategy and implementation across our system, which is 24 branches. She's served in EDI roles over the last 6 years, and in her previous role served as Assistant Vice President for the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center and Tulsa Schusterman campus. Oh my goodness, that's such a mouthful. Carrie received her BA and master's degree in human relations with a counseling focus from OU. And she is a licensed professional counselor in the state of Oklahoma with over 10 years of experience in the mental health field. Additionally, she teaches as an adjunct professor for the clinical mental health counseling program at the University of Oklahoma. And she enjoys family time with her 2 girls and her spouse, loves to travel and try new things, and we're very excited to have her here today. Welcome to you, Carrie. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm glad that you were able to get back on and help us out here. But I am really thankful to be here with you all this afternoon. I am going to work on sharing my screen and hopefully you all see that okay in terms of that PowerPoint. And then I'm going to toggle a bit here so that I can try to see more folks on my screen. The joys of Zoom. So I like to tend to start out our presentation with just a very with our land acknowledgement, recognizing that we are not we are on sovereign land and just wanting to pay respect and give honor and homage to that. I won't read our land acknowledgement statement word for word, but I do like to spend just a couple seconds with our land acknowledgement on the screen to give you all time to digest that. Okay, before I jump in, just a bit about me. I think that context is so important when I'm in speaking spaces. And oftentimes when I'm speaking from my direct experience, but it tends to help to get an understanding of where that experience is coming from when I talk a little bit about myself. So again, my name is Carrie McLean, pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as a Black and Mexican first generation cisgender woman and mother. Those roles and those identities play a huge part in who I am, in my experience, how I navigate spaces, how I see the world, and also how I tend to interpret things as well through some of those lenses. Um, my role here is the Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of my journey here and the time that I've spent here. But just again, a little bit of background as we begin our time with each other. So hopefully today, by the end of this time that we've had, our learning objectives are to make sure that you all understand the importance of internal equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts, and then identify how Tulsa City County Library has embedded equity, diversity, and inclusion into our internal library spaces. And then lastly, hopefully increase your knowledge of and access to strategies that can aid you in you all as you navigate your own ED&I initiatives or journey in your internal library spaces. So I'm going to start with giving you all just a little bit of context and background about TCCL. I'm going to talk a little bit about intention because that piece is very important when beginning this work. And even if you've already began this work, really starting to embed that intention into the work is going to be highly important. And I'll talk a bit through that and what that means. Also, we'll go through our internal EDI focus, some of the efforts that we have been really doing a lot of work in. And then we'll talk about some application. How can you all think about including some of these things into your system or library spaces? I also like to leave you all with some things to consider, because this is not, even with giving you all some applications or let's say some tips and tricks and ideas, this is not easy work. And so I'd love to leave you all with some considerations to think about as you're navigating this. And then lastly, we'll make time for some questions. So just for context purposes, as Rebecca had stated earlier, we have 26 different library sites within our system, 24 public facing libraries, and then 2 other sites that are internal facing. We have 4 resource centers around our system as well. And that leaves us with about a little over 400 FTE in our system. So when we talk about my role here is to really engage all 400 folks, but also engaging us in our library spaces and the locations we have around our county. So we had to begin somewhere, and our work began really in 2018, where a diversity and inclusion committee was formed. We began to see the importance of diversity and inclusion and began to sort of figure out what is one tangible way that we can sort of start this work. And that began again with our diversity and inclusion committee that had folks from around the system on that committee looking at what we were doing. I will say that this committee itself was really focused a lot around HR in a sense. And I'm sorry, my printer is going off back there for some reason. Apologies. But in 2019, our CEO, Kim Johnson, made a formal announcement and commitment to the whole system around our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts during our staff development day. So although that we know that around 2020, we really began to see an increase of efforts in EDI around the nation, along with COVID and George Floyd, we had already began looking at the importance of some of this work prior to that. Those things happening just began to compound and even bring more importance to the work that we were doing. So in 2020, we had our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Council established, and that council really began to take hold of leading the way in charting a path forward for what we were going to do across the system. So not only looking specifically sort of at our HR department, but holistically outside of that. How are we going to engage people in doing this work? Internally focused. And then in 2021, my position was created to join the leadership team, which was really important. When having someone doing the EDI work in your space, there has to be given some sort of authority and power so that they can move the work forward. Otherwise, there may be gatekeeping or other obstacles that tend to get in the way and hinder being able to move that work forward in an internal manner. We also begin incorporating EDI by being intentional with our projects, our budgets, our programs, and evaluating current processes that we had. And then an EDI support team was formed. So our EDI council sort of made the decisions at this higher level with our CEO. And then our support team were sort of going to be our doers. So if we said we're going to do this project, then we would get with that EDI support team and sort of say, how can we implement this into the system? And so that was how that functioned for us. And then in 2021, January, I was officially hired and came on board to the TCCL family. And from there, we've been going and moving, but more so exploring was a piece of what I did first, exploring what was happening across the system and the work that was being done. And there was a lot of work being done. This is my second time where I've come into a space and created this initial EDI office. The first time there was nothing there around the system. And so coming to a space where there were active programs, active work happening, active projects happening was helpful, but we really needed to get an understanding of how we can not only streamline, but also begin to have people work together and have a more cohesive outline strategic plan moving forward. So I want us to think about why we even began to think about doing this work internally. Why was it so important that we look at ourselves and understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and the impact that it's going to have on our system? And there are several different cases for doing this EDI work. My least favorite, and this is probably because my own bias, and my background as a counselor, but there is always the business case number one. And although you see on my slide, it's listed here last because it is my least favorite, but there is always the business case of why EDI is so important and so great for organizations, even outside of library systems. And it's always that case of we can increase our innovation and our creativity. When we have diverse people, we have diverse thoughts, and that brings us different ideas and perspectives, and that leads to increased productivity and better performance amongst our staff and our employees, which then can increase our ROI. That to me is not a people-centered approach. And I am very much a people-centered person, especially coming from my counseling background. But absolutely for some businesses, this makes sense for them, for why this is so important. There's also the people case, right? Just the fact that your people matter, who you're working with, who you're working next to, they matter. Their sense of belonging matters as well to you, whether they feel like they can be included in that space and come to work being their authentic selves. But this also helps in the case of burnout. Having that increased inclusion and equity tends to help decrease burnout for employees. And then that also helps with the workplace culture. You see an increase of not only less burnout, but also people wanting to be at work, that culture thriving, and it being a space where people see themselves and want to be there. My favorite reason for doing this work, in particular for myself, is that this psychological safety matters. Allowing people the space to bring their authentic selves into their workspace matters. Knowing that I don't have to hide a part of who I am when I come into this space matters. Knowing that if I'm going through a hard time, I can still walk through my doors and get empathy from a colleague, get understanding from a colleague, and still be supported in being able to do my work. That matters. Not only that, but equity and justice in and of itself matters. It matters to me whether we're getting treated equitably, whether I'm a man or a woman, right? That matters personally to me. It also helps with authenticity. Again, being able to show up fully as I am and who I am, no matter where I may be at in my life or what I may be going through. And this allows for a person-centered approach with others. So I'm not approaching everyone the same, but I know that what Beth may be going through and how I interact and engage with her is going to look different from what and how I interact with Rebecca based on what she's going through and what I know that she's dealing with at work, right? So this person-centered approach allows for us to have empathy and compassion, but it also, again, increases this inclusion and equity in our workspaces. So you can take some of those different realms of why EDI matters, and you can sort of look at the business case on through that heart and head case. Whatever the case may be, it's important either way that as library systems, as public facing entities, that we're thinking about doing this work. I wanted to shift this to talk a little bit about intention. Intentionality matters so much to me in doing this work. And oftentimes, many of you may have heard of the saying of, your intent matching your impact when it comes to hurting others, right? When we think about intention, though, when we think about it at the system level, it's important that we are cognizant of that intent versus impact in the same stance. So when that intent, the intention of the programs that we're doing, the intention of the work that we're creating does not align with the impact, what we'll see is that what's well intended may not produce the impact we'd like to see. So we can think of, this may be a really helpful thing to, for example, do a book club. You do the book club and you're starting to see that it's not really producing the impact that you'd like it to see, that you'd like for it to have. Are people learning from the book club? Are they getting a new perspective on maybe a different culture, a different background? Are they able to apply what they're learning from that book into their everyday spaces? So when doing the work, I want to be intentional, but I want to also be just as focused on the impact that I want to make happen. By definition, this intentionality means to be deliberate and purposeful, right? When we're being intentional, we want to make sure it's purposeful. But in our context, it means to create this environment that each specific individual needs is to thrive. So when we think about aligning the intent with the impact, one way that we can do that is by asking ourselves, how will this activity directly change the ability of excluded populations to thrive? How will this idea be able to allow everyone to access resources? Or how will this participate in the decision-making process of the institution on an equal footing with those who are already in charge? So when we talk about matching that impact and the intent, we have to take the additional step of asking ourselves some of these intentional questions, right? Not just looking at the lens from our viewpoint or from our seat at the table. I'm at the leadership team. If you're unable to answer those questions because you can't see sort of at those levels, or you don't have that experience at the different levels, invite those people to the table. Ask them the question so that they're included, or at least their thoughts are included, so that you get a better perspective in making those decisions and are making sure that you're not leaving other people out. So again, just an example of how we can think about matching the intent and being just as thoughtful with that impact piece so that we are doing a better job at doing the work. I thought, we talk about radical empathy and we talk about all this radicalness in different ways and perspectives. And for me, this is what radical intention looks like. It is thinking about not only the intent, but the impact at the same time. So we know that the meaning of radical is root, getting to the root of things, right? So the real problems we know tend to lie at the root. So to solve them, we need to start there. Clipping the leaves isn't enough. And when I say clipping the leaves, I'm thinking of those sort of one-off things that we think are great ideas. And after that, nothing else happens. That's us clipping the leaves rather than getting to the root of what are the policies, what are the procedures that are impacting our staff and making them feel like this space isn't for me or I'm being left out. So intention is an important aspect of moral responsibility. And impact-only formulations do not allow us to assess our roots. So utilizing both that intent and that impact to drive our ED&I journey allows us to identify and acknowledge the roots while creating the solutions for the change that need to happen. So I'm trying to be cognizant of time. When we talk about our internal focus, I want to talk about some of the things that we've done here within our system. One thing that has to happen very early on to make sure that your staff and your organization understands what you need, what you're doing, the philosophy and the values, creating your statements. Sometimes you may see organizations with a vision statement, a mission statement, but there does need to be a crafted statement that leadership believes in. Not only does leadership believe in, but they believe that they can execute doing, and that trickling down to staff as well. Our ED&I statement, as you can see, is here on the screen. We wanted to definitely leave space. There's a lot you can say and a lot you can commit to, but all those things won't matter. That statement won't matter if you're not putting the work in behind it to make that true. So with whatever statement that you create, whether it is a mission, a vision, goal statement, please make sure that not only can you be committed to the statement, but you can be committed to doing the statement in action. So our library is committed to ensuring a positive and professional working environment in which all people are treated with respect and dignity. That's a broad statement, but there are so many specific things that we can do internally to get to that point, to make that happen. And we'll talk through some of those things that we're doing. The next thing, one of the things that I looked at within my first 90 days of being here at TCCL was looking at how do we frame doing our EDI work? How do we make sure that what we're doing is, again, not only impactful, but it's helpful? And we're looking at our system holistically, but even down to the people. And I take sort of a people and systems approach because I think that that is how you move the needle in doing this work. It involves the people, but it also involves those systems, right, that we're looking to dismantle or looking to navigate doing a better job at. So when looking at this framework, I began with thinking about high level, we're working on creating this access and equity really globally for our staff. And that trickles down to us looking at those, like I stated, those inclusive policies, our practices, our procedures. Do our staff see themselves in those policies and procedures, or are we leaving a group out by not thinking about time off for dads when they've just had a newborn, right? So on the systems level, looking at access and equity in pay, right? Access and equity in being able to go into leadership positions. Systems piece, when we come down to the individual level, we're thinking about the cultural and emotional intelligence on an individual level. So we have done a really good job at communicating to our system that EDI is important for us and that we are working on it. The second part of that is communicating to our staff that it is everyone's responsibility to do that work. And in doing that work, it does take a little bit of cultural and emotional intelligence. And everyone starts at a different space on that continuum, what I'd like to call a continuum. But having that emotional intelligence when we're engaging with each other, wanting to learn about different pieces of identities of people and staff. And that trickles down to the psychological safety. Again, being able to come into our workspaces, not feeling afraid that we can't be who we are or we have to hide a piece of who we are when we're coming through our doors. We're feeling like I'm going to get treated differently because I hold this specific identity or because someone doesn't understand why my pronouns are different from my gender, right? Those things matter, and those things all contribute to this sense of psychological safety for our staff. So on that individual level, us looking at creating the psychological safety for our staff and bringing in those opportunities to increase that cultural and emotional intelligence. So basically, any work that we're doing, we're working within this framework to get that work done. Our ED&I definitions, these are very wordy. So I'm not going to read them line for line, but I put these here just to stress the importance of having that common language and understanding of what you all mean around equity, diversity, and inclusion in your spaces. it's very important that staff can recognize not only what you mean by that to distinguish the difference, but that so that they too can do their part in their role in that equity, diversity, and inclusion work that you're doing around your systems or your library spaces. Equity could look different from someone, right, else considered their background and their experiences compared to another person. So again, it's just highly important that the system itself has this definition of what it means to the system as you're doing the work so that everyone has that shared knowledge and that shared understanding of the work that's being done. So our internal focus, I tried to really sort of narrow down into some 3 or 4 bullet points. There's been a lot of work done, but if I could sort of put them into buckets, then I would say that we've really worked on our communication efforts in regards to our ED&I commitments, our journey, where we are, our needs, where we're going, highly important. We've also really worked on creating space for people, and I'll kind of break that down into what that looks like in our space. Excuse me, also increasing our staff's knowledge and awareness around EDI, not only just those definitions, but other principles and other identities. So often I've come into a lot of spaces and people really think of diversity as this binary between race and gender, rather than being able to expound upon. And a lot of EDI work is really increasing people's knowledge, helping them understand not only what you mean, but also what other concepts can help people understand and think about equity and inclusion. So for instance, empathy. How does empathy play a role in equity and inclusion and diversity? We can also think about cultural humility. How does that also help us or can play a role in us being equitable and having inclusive spaces? And then lastly, recruit and retain, looking at our staff makeup, not only how we're recruiting, where we're recruiting, who we're recruiting, and then also the retention piece being just as important. We have to, if we're recruiting and wanting diverse folks in our spaces, we have to make sure that our space is a space where people see themselves, where they feel like they can grow, and where they feel like they have that support to do those things. And again, I'll sort of break all these things down into how we've done this. In regards to our communication, being very transparent and upfront with our system. And that started really from the leadership down. Our CEO took a stance and was very open, honest, and direct about the role that we were going to play with now being intentional and focused on EDI and why it was important. And also thinking about how to message consistently. It wasn't like we could say this one time and then that be it, right? We had to continue to reiterate and continue to bring it up in spaces to remind people this is the journey we're on, we're working towards this, and how we deliver those messages also. So not only through email, but can we do it, how else can we make sure that people are getting this communication? And in the life of COVID, when the pandemic first started, one way we started with doing that was by doing town halls, virtual town halls, inviting all of our staff to host a town hall and us talking about the goals, what we were doing next, or the upcoming program that we would be engaged in. We also started with a culture survey as well, surveying the system in terms of their thoughts around what was needed or what we needed to be doing. And then communication alerts, which are pretty much our system-wide emails out to our staff, making sure that we were, again, consistent in messaging. So I believe there was at least like a monthly communication alert going out about the work that was being done, or again, the upcoming projects that were happening. Since then, we've added having a new hire orientation segment. And in that segment, I come in and I introduce myself to our new staff. I talk about the importance of EDI. I talk about not only the system's responsibility in EDI, but our staff's individual personal responsibility to EDI and the expectation of that. for the new staff coming into our system. We also have an EDI onboarding segment training that is online and part of everyone's sort of 90 days training piece that they have to complete. We've also now have a monthly ED&I newsletter, and in that newsletter, we will populate news sort of happening around the system in regards to any EDI subjects. We'll talk about the Heritage Month and make sure to highlight resources that may be helpful for people to, excuse me, to click and see more information, giving them resources to videos or webinars or books. We also add what our affinity groups may be doing or any community sort of projects or events that are happening that may be exciting or helpful for the staff that wants to engage in it. And then lastly, we have an employee ED&I goal added to our annual evaluations. This is one thing that I've been super excited about because I can't tell you for how long I've been in spaces where we have talked around and said and know that one way that we can hold staff responsible for increasing their knowledge, for participating in, excuse me, for participating in the ED&I efforts. And one way that we have always said is let's add that to annual evaluations. Let's add that into that space, and that holds them accountable. But this has been the first space that I've been in where we've had that discussion and we've actually moved forward with doing that. And that looks like just a question on their PDRs to say, what have you engaged in that has helped increase your knowledge around ED&I, or what have you actively participated in to increase your knowledge? So again, placing that responsibility on the employee to take part in that. And that can look like anything. If that staff person feels like I want to read 5 different cultural books throughout the year to help increase my knowledge, then that is excellent. If another staff person says, I want to get trained in this particular training experience that's going to help me to understand this particular background, then great. So we do not limit what that looks like for each staff person. That is something that they have to identify for themselves, because while we want to hold them responsible, we also have to be careful to allow people to learn and do what they feel comfortable with at their own pace. So there's the responsibility, and you can choose how you go about doing that, but we do want to hold you accountable to adding to this inclusive culture that we're building. When we talk about creating space for people, one of the key priorities for the organization was building out and creating affinity groups for our staff. Affinity groups can help build community. They can help develop leadership opportunities for our leaders in our affinity group spaces. But most of all, it just gives people a space to come into and maybe talk about things that they don't normally talk about or are able to talk about in our day-to-day. There's so much time where we're just going from one meeting to the next and doing that project. And a lot of times we come into meetings and it's like straight to business. Here's the agenda, let's go, right? But these affinity groups create space for us to sort of woosah. They create space for us to ask questions. How are you feeling? Did you hear about that thing that just happened last week? How did that affect you? Are you doing okay? Let's talk about stress management that we can start to do that may be helpful in our spaces. So it helps to build that community, that camaraderie. It gives people a space to be heard, to be listened to, and can help other folks sort of get ideas on how they can manage as well. And creating these affinity groups, we developed a leadership structure and selection process. So we currently have these listed affinity groups here are Nubian Voices, Native Voices, Unidos, Rainbow Alliance. We're working on solidifying our neurodiverse and epidemic affinity groups. But each of those has a leadership structure where they have a chair and a co-chair. in that group that is helping to navigate what that group is doing. When I came in, there were about 5 focus areas, and each affinity group could choose 3 different focus areas to look at and to focus on. We went ahead and narrowed it down to 3 focus areas that the affinity groups could focus on consistently throughout the year, and those include community involvement. Involvement can look like several different things, but for us specifically, this looks like when there is a specific community event happening that affinity group may identify with. They may want to go and table at that particular event. And so they will bring resources and library card information, coloring sheets, things to engage people in and talk about our services and resources from the library. So one specific event is our Tulsa Juneteenth event that we have annually. Great turnout, and our Nubian Voices affinity group tabled at one of the events there at the Juneteenth event, excuse me. We signed up kids for our summer reading program. The kids got a chance to color, and again, take home resources that would be helpful for the kids to have or participate in later on in the year. So that is what community involvement can look like for our affinity groups. In regards to advocacy and awareness, our staff are wonderful and they are passionate, and that is great. And one thing that I consistently saw was them exercising this advocacy and awareness. So bringing forth issues or problems they were seeing around the system that they felt were important to that specific affinity group or community. And that, for example, looked like our Unidos group. We talked about the need for more Spanish speaking staff in the system, or can we create a word bank of phrases, Spanish phrases that may be helpful for staff to utilize when they do have Spanish speaking customers coming into their spaces and we don't have a Spanish speaking staff available to help them. So that advocacy and awareness really helping to bring light to issues that they may be seeing in our system, raise those concerns to myself, and then I sort of funnel those concerns to our ED&I council to talk about, how do we move this forward? And we'll also get our EDI support team in again, doing the tangible tasks to help do those things. And then lastly is social connect. And that social connect piece is really that community gathering, that community building, community space. That could look like their monthly meetings that they host, having a speaker come in and talk about a particular topic that's important to the group or something that they feel may be helpful for the group to know. It could also be, we're going to host a game night here at one of the libraries, and we're going to have some snacks while we do that and just have community with each other. So those are a few different ways that we have actionably looked at our focus areas and done those things in each of those. When we talk about increasing our knowledge and awareness, one way that we've done that, and I'll talk about 2 different avenues, and the first will be our book club. Let's talk about book club. That was one of the first bigger projects that we did with the system to not only increase knowledge and awareness, but at the time that came about, it was also a way for us to community build with our staff as well. So being able to create space for staff, not only were we learning through the use of books and narratives, but we were also having community with each other while we were having these discussions. So we developed a process and a structure for the book club. We choose one specific book to focus on and then have several different book club meetings. And in each session, basically, just to sort of break down what that looked like again, we would host a Zoom and then we would have our questions already prepared. We had facilitators to help facilitate each of the breakout rooms where we would break out folks into, and we would try to keep those smaller breakout rooms to about 6 to 8 people, a manageable size for us to manage those discussions. And then we'd have the small group discussions for about 40 minutes or so and come back into our larger group, bringing everyone back in to wrap up our discussions, summarize or give thought to just anything people felt compelled to share that they learned or heard from someone else in their group. We did do a facilitator training to help prep our facilitators just for, how to manage a difficult conversation or how to just manage and facilitate in the small breakout room so that they felt comfortable enough and prepared enough to go into that space to do that. Here you have a list of our titles that we've done thus far, and we are currently in the midst of Crying in Age Smart, and we'll be wrapping that book up next month. But we've also partnered with our affinity groups with helping us to identify which book title would be a good next read, if you will. And then our collection management has also partnered with us in that program as well to secure the titles for distribution when giving the books out to our participants. And then the second way I want to talk about increasing, I misspelled awareness. I'm seeing that now. Increasing our knowledge and awareness is really through training and learning opportunities. Again, so much of ED&I work is helping people understand and learn the concepts and things around ED&I. And we began with doing that in a professional development way, really focused on increasing people's understanding and awareness with different concepts and different things. So externally, there were some times where we had worked with an external partner, or company or organization to help bring in that knowledge base or that training. And that has looked like our unconscious bias training that we've been doing with Brene Myers. When we outrolled our unconscious bias training, this is also another training done in the onboarding of our new staff. And when we first outrolled this was something that all staff had to complete and do. And now currently, as new staff are getting onboarded, it is the second sort of ED&I focused training that they have to complete. And helping really people to understand what does unconscious bias mean, how can that show up in your workspaces. And we also included this Inclusive Leadership Institute from the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice, where they came in and did a workshop with us, and then a disability etiquette workshop as well. So internally, there's also been ways that we have worked with our staff to bring about opportunities for us to learn and engage with each other from. And that's looked like our staff development day classes. Each year for the past couple of years, our affinity groups have, each of the affinity groups has helped to do a class, a topic of their choice. Last year, our Unidos group did one class just on, this is who Unidos is and how you can participate. And then they did a second class on just Spanish phrases that may be helpful for people to use in their everyday space when working with customers. We've also done a Walk a Mile in My Shoes panel as well, where we had folks from just different identities talk about their lived experiences so that we could allow our staff to get insight into what that has looked like for them, what that experience has looked like for them. We've also added personal ED&I goals, as I stated before, to our professional development annual evaluations. And again, something that each staff is responsible for identifying for themselves. And then lastly, we also do a recommended books list provided by our affinity groups as well. And that's always usually helpful, especially during a specific Heritage Month. Like for Juneteenth, our Nubian Voices created a book list of titles, and then our marketing team created a really beautiful bookmark that we were able to hand out while we were at the Juneteenth event. So that's also ways of how we've worked with different departments as well within the system internally to do the work. And then when we talk about recruit and retain, we began to really look at the focusing on our diverse applicant pool and focusing on our diverse candidate pool. So you have your applicants and then you have your candidates, right? Us being intentional on what has that been looking like? Let's get a benchmark for our numbers in those particular areas. And then let's think about our goals for what we would like for them to look like. So our HR department has done a phenomenal job at being intentional in that space and asking those questions to themselves of, one, if we didn't meet the goal, what can we be doing differently, or what is going to be helpful? But I'll say that they have done a great job at actually meeting their goals. And then looking at what has their outreach look like? Do we need to change the outreach that we're doing? Do we need to be more intentional on specific spaces for outreach? And so some of the HR metrics also that HR began to look at was doing a Count Me In campaign, just looking at our diversity again internally within our staff makeup to get a baseline for our metrics when looking at creating new KPIs each year for our HR department. Training for hiring and hiring purposes. So when we talk about that, really looking at bias in the hiring process and having specific training around that piece. Our HR department has also become certified in veteran, disability, and minority hiring. And I want to say that they do have the certification for the veteran piece. So again, looking at different pieces of diversity and how we're being more intentional with creating space for them. And we have increased our number of identified veterans that have now started working in our system since our HR started their work. And then again, in HR, we have also looked at interview questions. So thinking about how are we making sure that we're getting the applicants in the door, getting the diverse candidates in the door. But once we are actually in that space to interview them, let's think about interview questions that we can ask around, like how do you define ED&I? What does that mean to you? Is it important? Because as we're continuing our journey to be more inclusive and equitable, it's really important that as people are being onboarded, that they understand that from the get-go and that they're just as committed to doing that work. And asking these interview questions sort of helps us to discern that. And then also working with our public relations and marketing department to reflect our ED&I commitment and our marketing and hiring sort of communications pieces. So we begin to look at our HR website and are we being intentional to let people know and understand that we are an organization that is committed to ED&I. And we have spaces for our staff members here who see themselves working with us by way of our community, by way of our affinity groups and creating community spaces for our staff. And so application, you want to make sure when applying or thinking about this internal process of ED&I, you want to make sure that one, your leadership has to be on board. Your leadership has to understand the importance. They have to be just as invested and committed to the work. You need human capital, you need staff who can do the work, and you do need a budget to do the work. I'm not saying a big budget, but let's have something to commit to doing the work. The next phase is making sure that, again, you communicate out to your system the importance of and the fact that you're on this journey and what that looks like. Every communication is going to be different, right, compared to each system. But again, just very important that your system knows what the commitment is and what the expectation is. You then want to look at those intentional and actionable EDI statement, policies, mission and vision statements, whatever you want to call them, and crafting those things to help you begin to start your journey to understand what's important for us, right? And it's okay to not do everything at once. It is okay to not do everything at once. This is a lot of work. And if you don't have the human capital, it can be even more tough. If you don't have the budget, it can be even more tough, right? So take time to be intentional about those statements, about what you're being committed to make sure that you can actionably carry those out. You want to make sure that you assess and collect data. Just like many other spaces, data collection is important to understand how well your program is doing, how effective is it. It's the same thing even in these EDI spaces for particular projects. For instance, a book club, how many people are attending? Are we doing a feedback form or a assessment form when they leave to say, was this helpful? What did you learn? Can you apply this in your everyday workspace? making sure that you're looking at those things to assess what is already happening, to inform you of where you need to be going. Define those specific goals around your ED&I goals, your KPIs, your key performance indicators, and the strategies that you want to use to get those goals done, or to get to those goals. And then you want to evaluate those implemented strategies and programs. So it becomes sort of like, I don't want to say a hamster wheel, but it becomes this cycle of do the thing, evaluate. Do we need to switch courses? Is there something else that makes more sense for us at this time? What is meeting our needs at this time? And sort of doing that whole thing all over again when we're talking about the programming pieces of ED&I things, which is the fun piece. Challenges very quickly. Challenges that I have seen here in our space, and I think that we've come into contact with, is sometimes moving from concept into practice and application. So learning EDI concepts and information to transcend it into practice. There are so many cookie cutter trainings and things, educational opportunities nowadays in regards to ED&I, one most popular being unconscious or implicit bias. Please make sure that when you're looking at these opportunities, that people can really be able to get an idea of the concept and be able to go from concept to practice. If we're talking about unconscious bias, I understand the concept. Now, how do I put that into practice? That is me starting to learn about my own biases. That is me bringing that awareness into my thought around, okay, I have this bias. I'm in contact with a particular person that may have this particular bias that I have. How do I navigate that? I'm becoming aware. How do I now navigate that? So moving from concept into practice is huge. This work cannot be done alone. Identify your partners, identify your allies, your supporters, your doers, your movers in getting the work done, because it's going to take all of those things in getting the work done. This work is slow and steady. It is not it's not a race. It is not a sprint. It is a journey. And it takes time to move things. And if we're talking about systems, then we're talking about a long time. So make sure that you have that understanding from the get-go and that expectation. I think that's been the one thing that has helped me along my journey, is every time I've come into a space, I recognize that change isn't going to happen overnight and it's going to take time. Everyone is not going to be on board with where the system is headed. Very plain and simple. We are all different people. We all have different experiences. And because of that, everyone won't be ready, won't be as ready as you are, or maybe more ready. It just depends, right? So keep that also in mind. You're going to have people who are going to continue, I don't want to say to fight, that's not the word, but who maybe oppose or maybe not be ready for this. And that's going to be in any space. You're never going to have 100% of people on board, and that's okay. I'll spend my time and my efforts working with those of us who are ready. And you know what? You'll still get the opportunity to participate should you want to, or should you get to that space of now being ready to take on this journey with us. And then emotional intelligence, to meet people where they are. I have a counseling background, and so that is my saving grace to this work. But we have to be able to practice emotional intelligence in some spaces that we come into when I'm working with some particular folks. So very important for you to be aware of emotional intelligence, be aware of your identities, how you come into spaces with those identities with you, and understanding the other people who are going to be in the room to help you navigate that space. So before getting started, understand both your intention and your impact. Recognize that this is laborious work. Be prepared to work. Be prepared for the long haul, and sometimes even some exhaustion. But also know that this is a people-centered profession and self-awareness is highly important. And most importantly, have a thought partner, have a mentor, or someone you can reach out to for support. And that doesn't always have to be someone in your space. If there is just someone you can go to, regardless of if they are in that system, outside of that system, in another state, have someone that you can go to. It's so important. And then just lastly, this quote here, what propels the action is intention, because the intention is going to determine the reaction, the results, or the consequence. By my favorite, I'd like to say BFF, but I don't know. And so that concludes my presentation, and I have some time for questions. So I'll open up the floor to questions, thoughts, or concerns.
Harry, I feel like I want to work for Tulsa. This is incredible, you know.
Thank you.
Harry, I do a lot what Gary does and Heather does in your department.
Okay. Nice.
And onboarding, I really like what you had said today. You know, onboarding, it starts from the get-go
Yeah.
with libraries. This is who we are,
Yeah.
and this is you too.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important for all of us to do that, to create a space, not only on the backside and the stacks and so forth, but also out front as well. And I like how you did the circle, you know, and how we all are on board with this. My question to you is, it is so difficult because we're dealing with a governor, we're dealing with state legislators, we're dealing with a superintendent of education that hate all of this.
Yes.
And we have to wake up and deal with this every day.
Yeah.
And how do we deal with that?
Yeah. I think I am probably an optimist. I think that there's always a way to get around the way. And what I mean by that is, what I've learned in doing this work is that vocabulary and words matter. Those things matter. When I say diversity, for some people, that is a hot button. For other folks, I'm happy you said that. Let's talk more. Let's really get into that. I think that, again, that there's always going to be opposition in some way, form, or fashion. And some of this, I think, leads to the fact that people are afraid of losing power and control. And my job is to not get caught up in that with them. My job is to, if I can't walk this road straight forward, right, without those obstacles, without those challenges, how am I going to take the curve around that to still get us there? Maybe I need to change my language and how I'm describing that. Maybe I can call that something else, but as I am explaining it, we're all still getting to the same point, right? So for me, I am sometimes hyper aware of my vocabulary in particular spaces in order to sort of still get us to that end goal or to continue to move us forward. I will say, working in higher education, I began to see the challenges impact us even more so in that space. I am hating to see how it's starting to also impact our library spaces. But it screams the need for us to continue to do the work. And I think people becoming fearful and moving away is what they want to see and what they want to see happen. But I'll continue on. And I don't know if that answers your question directly, but.
Harry, there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
The first one, do you have any tools that you recommend to offer employees private self-assessments of where they are in intercultural development / unconscious bias so that they have a personal point to grow from?
Yes, so the first thing that comes to mind is the Harvard implicit bias test. there are an array of different types of tests that you can go in there and take. I used this tool back in the day with students in the university setting. And I'd always love when they get their results and they'd be like, and sort of questioning the test itself. And it's like, no, it did what it was supposed to do. I don't think that you just appreciate the results that you see in front of you, but that's what it's there for, to bring you into awareness of some of those blind spots that we may have. But there are so many different tests that you can take just to start there as sort of a starting point. And that's the first thing that comes to mind. If there are others though, which I'm sure I have a slide deck with some other recommendations or the resources, I can definitely send them your way, Rebecca, to disseminate, or to whoever's way may be best to disseminate.
That would be great. The
Yeah.
Harvard implicit bias test is really eye-opening and was a little bit shocking. So how do you protect yourself from the exhaustion / damage this work can do when you are usually on the receiving end of any lack of EDI measures? Tyler.
So that's a big piece of doing this work, is having that form of self-care. And although I try to say this is business and it's not personal, it's hard for it not to feel personal at times, especially if it feels like there's an attack or opposition to the identities you hold, or the inability sort of to get the work done. And people have to see their responsibility in that. And folks aren't always willing or ready or able to sort of see their responsibility in that as well. So one, really imploring self-care and what that looks like for you. Two, I really had to be very transparent. There are some spaces where it gets to a point in time where it feels like this isn't worth it for me in this space, right? The exhaustion that is causing me mentally, emotionally, psychologically, it's not worth it in this space. This is bigger, much bigger than me, and much bigger than what I can do. Granted, the lack of resources that I've been given or that I have. And so while I am a person who thrives on creating change, I also too have to make sure that I'm not taking more from myself, or putting more of myself on the line than that institution or that organization. And that is sometimes really hard to digest. But I think we're seeing the world differently, especially after COVID. And there's other ways to implore change and to make change. If I can't do it in this space, where can I, right? Maybe that is another space. Maybe that's me doing it on my own or in a nonprofit. But please, I would say, please don't do this to the detriment of yourself either. There's a balance there. So, Tyler, I'm hoping that made sense.
Hey, well, Carrie, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about, as always. And I did drop the evaluation in the chat. Please take a moment to fill that out, and I will send all your information over to CE as well. So thank you all for joining us, for taking the time, and yeah, we'll be in touch. Keep the faith.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everybody. Bye-bye.